Welcome back to the show, everyone. Craig and Jonah. So the other day I was so one of the conversations that we've had on and off goes back to Onan and kind of why the church teaches what it does about certain things. And I think I may have sort of figured out a few things, maybe.
Mm.
So a couple things. There's definitely flavors of onanism in the story of Onan in the church's teaching, and we kind of referenced that in a prior episode. But and also I think quite frankly it stems back to Thomas Aquinas and his treatment about what's natural and unnatural. Um,
Which was quite conservative.
yes, I don't think anyone wants to take on Thomas Aquinas. I think I'm not saying the guy is an idiot, but I don't think he was perfect, and I think he's got some things wrong.
Yeah, and he lived in a much different time, if you are going to take the customs of the time into account.
Yes. Well, that's a really good segue because so the other day I was listening to this podcast, Trent Horn. If you haven't heard of him,
I haven't.
he's a I stumbled upon him maybe a month or two ago on Twitter. He's I think he's with like Catholic Answers or something like
Oh,
that. Really recommend the guy. Like the guy is, I would say, kind of middle of the road, but just a really good blend of being very smart, very articulate, not wishy-washy, but also just sensitive. Like,
mm-hmm.
he's just not rah rah, real hard trad or hard liberal. He's just very good and articulate. Highly recommend if you want kind of a voice of reason, check out Trent Horn. He's got a great podcast name. It's called Council of Trent.
Oh, that is good.
I think,
That is funny.
yeah. So he's got the best podcast name, but he was talking about something that Pope Benedict wrote about, which I hadn't heard about. And so Pope Benedict, I don't know if this was an encyclical he wrote, but he talked about the dark passages of Scripture.
Okay.
And so Pope Benedict had gone through and tried to kind of confront the certain aspects of the Old Testament that um, challenge our modern sensibilities, I guess.
Okay.
Going to things such as, like polygamy and I think even the story of Onan, the whole Levitical, the whole thing that Onan was even part of, like,
Do tell, I'm ready.
yeah, he doesn't reference that, but he talks about, and I'm not going to do it justice, but he talks about how God used the Old Testament people in their sort of cultural understandings at the time, which maybe weren't entirely theologically accurate, but used them where they were at the time to spread to teach a message, but essentially allowed them to infuse
The truth
within their society, which may not necessarily be perfect theological truth.
And at what point do you reach that perfection? Is that possible
I don't know.
in a
Maybe we're
human
still on
society?
that.
I mean, I suspect, right?
But when I heard that, I thought, all right, what about Onan? What about
All roads
these?
lead to Onan.
Yes, you can't escape it.
No.
Um, that's it. Like that is the most specific teaching, or scriptural reference, I guess, that leads to the whole the Catholic teaching on sexuality and where sperm is supposed to be and not be and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't help but wonder, is that an example of how the ancients viewed that, and is that really meant to be God's proclamation that never,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
It's a good point. I don't know. It's too bad he didn't talk about that specifically, but I'm sure there's a reason why.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
I think it's much safer and sexier to explain away polygamy than it is to come to the defense of the Onanites.
Onanites.
There just isn't a big lobby group for masturbators.
No, there isn't. It's true.
And puller outers.
That's a pretty secret group.
Yeah,
like that.
No one really wants to take charge and be the face of that
It's
movement.
not a united front. It's true.
I bet it's got more members than any other group.
That's true. Across all political divisions. I mean, it's just it's out there.
That's the common bond.
Yeah.
But it's a huge army with huge army with no leader.
Yep, that's true.
But now we have the missionary to the masturbators. So there's a book on it, and so I'm actually gonna maybe have to check out that book. But I really thought maybe that's the way to understand some of that stuff. And
Father Longenecker talked about that too, about how in societies where they live, like in the Amazon, where they don't live as modern humans, you get married when you're very as a teenager, and those sorts of things aren't issues, whereas we wait till we're 30 to get married, and only have 2 kids, and I don't know, it raises a whole different set of issues.
Yeah, I just think I think it's extremely possible that our quote unquote modern, the church teaching, so to speak, is very much kind of some of these Old Testament scriptural stuff and then you got St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who had their own views of reality, and I think had a pretty pessimistic view of human sexuality,
which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I think there's this strong tendency in Catholic philosophy and theology to kind of take the stuff that we don't like, or maybe our present cultural attitudes don't like, and just chalk that up to concupiscence. All right, well, I don't like that. I don't like the male sex drive. That must be concupiscence.
And it is interesting to think that, guys like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, those guys lived lives that we can't even imagine today. Like, I mean, I don't know exactly when Aquinas lived, but obviously it's hundreds of years ago. And I mean, life was just totally different.
Yep.
I mean, he couldn't even imagine what we have access to today.
Right. Well, and Augustine, of course, lived a very sordid life and was I think struggled with it all his life. And how much of that, I don't know if embarrassment or shame or reacting against that life that he once had, that he hated, did that influence his views on these things? I don't know, but
because that sort of activity outside of marriage is different than what goes on within marriage. And I mean, they're not even equivalent.
Right. I think that's I'm an experience from my perspective and experience. The reality in a marriage is much different than it is when you're still single or whatever, but the church doesn't really make those distinctions. We kind of got these rules on this and this. There's hints of it, like I said, there's reference to marriage or marital acts versus non-marital acts, but I think it certainly seems to me that if you're talking about a couple, they're married and committed and they're doing all the right things, how much do we really scrutinize?
Do you regulate that?
Yeah. I don't know. Marriage is very difficult under the best of circumstances. Then you make it
more complicated
than maybe it needs to be.
It's just tightening the vice.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm going to do some more studying on that, but one way or another, if we can't invent a time machine, maybe we'll use the hermeneutical approach and try and crack the connection to Onan and whatever, and see if that alters the trajectory of how we look at these things.
Yeah.
It seems like it should. At least.
It should, I think. I don't know. There just is some level of disconnect there between,
Yep.
just the realities of marriage and life today.
Yep.
I don't know.
And no one wants to touch that.
No.
Except us.
Just want to ignore it.
Yep.
And just blame it on concupiscence or.
Yep.
just whatever, and you're supposed to be stronger, and I'm not saying you aren't.
Yeah.
I'm just saying,
well, that's always a response. Well, just you're supposed to exercise self-discipline. Yeah, okay, I guess. But I had this is probably a stupid analogy, but I was thinking about this analogy the other day. Let's say like biologically we know that the size of the human bladder is such that you could.
I didn't see that coming.
Yeah. You see Jonah's face. Let's say it's size such that you could go, let's say 4 times a day. Like you could get it to max capacity.
Urination, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know what else you're gonna put in there.
I was the bladder interacts with the prostate. I wasn't sure where
we were going. Yeah. Let's say it's biologically possible to urinate, I don't know, 4 times a day. Maybe for some people that's what it is. My wife goes about half as much as I do.
All right.
But
this is quite the twist.
Yeah. So let's say it's biologically possible, and with enough self-discipline, you can get yourself to that.
Oh, I see.
But it's like, do you want to like be miserable the whole time instead of just going at a normal frequency where you're not, being having
that's actually a fair analogy, because then you risk bladder infections or health issues, and that is the same thing that happens, with guys. I don't know.
Yeah, which actually this will be a teaser for a future episode. But my wife the other day was asking about, so is there any connection between intimacy and prostate issues in men?
Well, let me tell you. I mean, that's just proven.
Yeah. So we're going to do an episode on that, because I think both from a, pick my words here, the basic chemical fluid issue of it, but I think just from a pure psychological and stress level, being, PMAS is just stressful and emotionally draining, and that's just never good. That's not a good environment for good health. But my wife asked about that, so we're gonna do so
you're doing a deep dive into the research on that?
Yeah, I'm going to, and we'll bring it here. So teaser.
Tune in for prostate health week or whatever that's gonna be.
Right. So anyway.
Well.
Okay, well, that's all I had, Jonah.
Sounds good.
So stay tuned for those. So thank you, Jonah. Until next time, everyone.
You bet. Bye.
Have a good one.